Everyone in that archive thought Nora Whittaker was weak. They saw her weight before they saw her mind. They saw a quiet woman in a basement carrying old boxes, filing forgotten papers, living a life nobody cared enough to question. But what they did not know was this. Nora remembered everything. Every misplaced file, every nervous glance, every lie hidden inside polite words. And when her dead father left behind a map that could expose the most dangerous men in Chicago, the only person who could read it was the woman everyone had ignored. Then a mafia boss named Callum Kane watched her do something no one expected. He watched the body they mocked become the strength that saved a life. Welcome to our channel, where we tell mafia boss stories not to glorify crime, but to reveal the mindset, courage, loyalty, and hidden rules behind real power. Some people are born to dominate, and some lessons are never taught in school. Only men who have survived the underworld understand them. This story reminds us that true strength is not always loud, thin, young, or beautiful by society's standards. Sometimes, true strength is the person who keeps standing after the world has spent years trying to make them feel small. If this story speaks to you, like the video, comment what strength means to you, share it with someone who needs this message, and subscribe for more Mafia Boss stories about power, dignity, and survival.
Nora Whittaker had memorized the location of 34 zero documents, but not one of them could tell her why her father had to die. At 9:47 on a Thursday night, she was alone in the basement of the Hargrove Institute, surrounded by metal shelves, cardboard archive boxes, and the kind of silence that made other people nervous. Nora liked that silence. It did not ask her questions. It did not stare at her body before it listened to her voice. It did not decide she was slow because she was heavy, or fragile because she breathed hard after climbing 3 flights of stairs with 40 pounds of paper in her arms. The basement simply waited. That was more respect than she usually got upstairs. She stood under a flickering fluorescent light, sorting through a donated box from a demolished house on the south side. Most of it was ordinary history. The kind people threw away until it became old enough to matter. Tax receipts, water-damaged letters, a photograph of a little boy holding a toy fire truck, a church bulletin from 1983, 3 property sketches folded into a cracked envelope. Nora handled each piece with care, not tenderness, exactly. Care. There was a difference. Tenderness was personal. Care was discipline. Her father had taught her that. History survives, Edmund Whittaker used to say, because somebody boring enough kept it safe. He had smiled when he said it. Nora had been 12 then, sitting at his kitchen table, watching him draw maps by hand with a patience that felt almost holy. He had made maps of streets, rail lines, neighborhoods, burned districts, forgotten cemeteries, and buildings that no longer existed, at least. That was what Nora had believed, until he died, 8 months ago. Chicago police told her Edmund had been killed during a robbery gone wrong. They said it kindly, which somehow made it worse. They said there were no strong leads. They said these things happened. They closed the case in 72 hours. Too fast, too clean, too final. By the time Nora reached her father's apartment, someone had already searched it, not ransacked, searched. There was a difference there, too. Drawers had been opened and closed. Floorboards had been lifted and put back. The cheap lock on his file cabinet had been replaced after it was broken, as if whoever came through wanted the room to look violated, but not interesting. All of Edmund's private maps were gone. Nora had spent 8 months being careful after that. Careful at work, careful at home, careful not to ask the wrong question in the wrong place. Careful not to let her younger brother Jake hear the fear in her voice when he called from Boston. Careful was exhausting. Careful was also the reason she was still alive. She reached the bottom of the donated box and touched paper thicker than the rest. Her fingers stilled. A map. For one long second, the basement disappeared. Nora did not move. She did not breathe. She stared at the thin black lines, the careful shading, the old-fashioned lettering in the corner. She knew that hand. She knew the slight pressure change where the pen curved around water. She knew the way her father marked alleys with more respect than avenues. Because he said alleys told the truth about a city. This was Edmund Whitaker's work. And it should not have existed. Nora looked over her shoulder. The basement was empty. Somewhere above her, a pipe knocked inside the wall. The old building settled. The world continued. Unaware that the dead had just reached up, through a box of forgotten paper, and touched her wrist, she folded the map carefully, slid it into the deep pocket of her coat, and picked up the next document as if nothing had happened. That was another thing people misunderstood about Nora. They thought because she was big, she was clumsy. They thought because she was quiet, she was slow. They had no idea how much of her life had been spent learning not to react. A few minutes later, footsteps came down the stairs. Dennis Miller appeared between the shelves, carrying a clipboard he did not need, and wearing the guilty smile of someone who wanted to seem helpful without actually helping. "You still down here?" he asked. "No, Dennis," Nora said, sliding a folder into place. "This is a projection." He laughed too loudly. "Funny. We reordering pizza upstairs if you want some. I mean, you've been down here all night. You should probably eat." There it was. The little pause before eat. The glance he tried not to make toward her body. Nora had heard versions of that sentence since she was 13. Eat less. Eat more. Eat better. Eat differently. Eat where people could not see you. Eat where people could see you and judge how much. "I am fine," she said. Dennis shifted his weight. "You sure? That box looks pretty heavy. I can grab it for you." Nora looked at the box beside her, then at him. "This one is 38 pounds. The one you dropped this morning was 22. Dennis blinked. "You also put probate records in municipal permits," she added. "Second shelf, wrong bay." His face reddened. "Right. Yeah, I was going to fix that." "Of course you were." He left a moment later, mumbling something about pizza. Nora waited until his footsteps faded before she allowed her hand to return to the coat pocket. The map was still there, real, heavy, impossible. She finished the box because unfinished work made people look twice, and Nora preferred being underestimated to being noticed for the wrong reason. At 10 minutes to closing, she carried a request box upstairs to the reading room. The room was nearly empty. Lamps glowed over long wooden tables. Snow tapped softly against the tall windows. Phil Turner, the night guard, stood near the front desk, pretending not to watch everything. And at the table closest to the east wall sat the man with no phone. Nora had noticed him the first time he came in. She noticed everyone, but him especially, not because he tried to be seen, because the room rearranged itself around him. Other researchers chose tables farther away. Staff lowered their voices. Phil opened doors before the man reached them. He looked like a professor someone had forgotten to age properly. Dark wool coat, gray sweater, clean hands, sharp eyes, a notebook placed squarely in front of him, no laptop, no phone. Just a fountain pen and stillness. His name on the visitor log was Callum Kane. Nora did not know what he wanted. That bothered her. She walked past him with the box balanced against her hip. A young researcher near the windows whispered to his friend. Not quietly enough. "Why do they make her carry those? She is going to hurt herself." Nora kept walking. She set the box on the correct table, turned the label outward, and adjusted it half an inch to align with the reading lamp. Then Callum Kane spoke without looking up. "Box 7C is shelved wrong." Nora stopped. His pen moved once across the notebook. "Sections 1000. 940 through 1000. 943 are behind 1000. 951 through 1000. 955. Third shelf from the left, if you need it." Nora turned slowly. No one knew that shelf was wrong except her. She had noticed it 2 hours ago, and had not fixed it yet because the donated box mattered more. Even Dennis, who had caused the error, did not know what he had done. "How do you know that?" she asked. Callum looked up. His eyes were not cold. Cold would have been easier. His eyes were attentive, exact, like he was reading a map and had just found a road that did not appear on the legend. "I notice things out of place," he said. "It's a habit." Nora held his gaze. "Then you must be tired." Something almost like amusement crossed his face. "Why is that?" "Because the world puts a lot of things where they don't belong." For the first time since he had started coming to Hargrove. Callum Kane looked at her as if she had surprised him. At closing, Nora checked the reading room. Callum was still there, his notebook closed. His pen aligned perfectly beside it. "We closed at 10, she said. It's 9:58. You've been here 4 hours and requested nothing from the archive. Sometimes a man comes to a place to remember what it used to hold." Nora felt the map in her coat pocket like a second heartbeat. "You knew my father," she said. Not a question. Callum stood, buttoning his coat. Phil was already by the door, though Nora had not called him. Callum looked at her for a long moment. "Edmund Whittaker was a careful man," he said. "Careful men don't leave maps behind by accident." The room seemed to narrow. Nora did not step back. She had spent a lifetime refusing to make herself smaller just because someone expected it. "What do you want?" she asked. Callum's gaze lowered briefly to her coat pocket, then returned to her face. "For now. For you to stay alive long enough to read what he left you." Then he walked away. Phil opened the door before Callum touched the handle. Nora stood alone in the reading room until the old building went quiet around her. Later, in her apartment, she unfolded the map on her kitchen table. Her hands did not shake until she saw the mark in the lower corner. Hidden inside the curve of what looked like the Chicago River, a private symbol. One her father had taught her when she was 10 years old. It meant, "If you are reading this, I was betrayed." Nora sat back slowly, the city glowing cold beyond her window. For 8 months, everyone had told her to move on. But the dead had just given her directions, and Nora Whittaker, who knew where everything was hidden, was finally going to start looking. Nora Whittaker did not sleep that night. She tried. She turned off the kitchen light, folded the map back into its careful squares, locked the apartment door, checked the chain, then checked it again. She took off her shoes, washed her face, and stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a long moment, looking at a woman whose eyes seemed older than they had been yesterday. People had always assumed things about Nora when they looked at her. That she was tired because of her weight, that she was lonely because of her size, that she was gentle because she was quiet, that she would accept a small life if it came wrapped in enough polite pity. But no one looking at her that night would have guessed what she was really carrying. A dead man's warning. A map that should not exist. And a name spoken by a stranger who should not have known her father. At 2 in the morning, she gave up pretending to rest and returned to the kitchen table. The city outside her window glowed blue and silver beneath the winter dark. Snow clung to the fire escape. Somewhere below, a plow scraped the street with a long metallic groan. Nora spread the map open again and pinned down the corners with a coffee mug, a salt shaker, her father's old brass compass, and a library stamp she had never returned to Hargrove. At first glance, it looked like an old map of Chicago. Streets, rail lines, old industrial corridors, the river branching through the city like a dark vein, but Nora knew better now. Her father had taught her that maps lied when people asked them to. A line could mean a road, or a border, or a debt. A blank space could mean wilderness, or secrecy, or shame. She leaned closer. The first layer was geographic, the second was historical. The third was personal. There were marks hidden inside marks, a small triangle tucked near a church, a broken line running beneath a warehouse that had been demolished 20 years ago, a cluster of dots around a block that officially belonged to 3 different holding companies. Nora's fingers moved slowly across the paper. "Come on, Dad," she whispered. "What were you trying to tell me?" Then she saw the first name, Callum Kane. It was written so small most people would have mistaken it for a street label. Nora would have, too, if she had not grown up watching Edmund hide messages in plain sight. A second name appeared near the West Loop, Marcus Webb. Nora knew that one. Her father had mentioned Marcus only twice, both times with the tight expression he wore when a memory tasted bad. Then she found the third name, and her hand stopped, Harlan Mercer. Senator Harlan Mercer was on television almost every night now. He was running for governor of Illinois, with perfect hair, perfect teeth, and the kind of voice that made lies sound like family values. He spoke about law and order. He spoke about protecting neighborhoods. He spoke about cleaning up Chicago. Nora stared at his name on her father's map until the letters blurred. The phone rang at 6:12 a.m. She did not move. The number was unknown. It rang until it stopped. Then it started again. Nora sat very still, one hand resting on the edge of the map. On the third call, she answered. For 2 seconds, there was only silence. Then Callum Kane said, "You found Mercer." Nora's grip tightened around the phone. "How did you get this number?" "The same way I know you have been awake all night." She looked toward the window. The curtains were drawn. Her apartment was on the third floor. No building stood close enough for a clear view inside. Callum continued, calm as snowfall. "And the same way I know you are sitting at your kitchen table instead of your desk because your father taught you to read ink in natural light." Nora did not let herself look around the room like a frightened woman in a movie. Fear wanted movement. She gave it none. "If you are watching me," she said, "you are less intelligent than I thought. I am not watching you." "Then you are guessing." "No," Callum said. "I am remembering Edmund." That hit harder than she wanted it to. Nora looked at the compass holding down the corner of the map. Her father's thumb had worn the brass smooth over years of use. "What do you want?" she asked. "I need to see the map." "No, I did not say take it." "No is a full sentence, Mr. Kane." There was a pause on the other end, not irritation. Something closer to approval. "Your father said that once." "My father said many things. Most of them did not involve strange men calling his daughter before breakfast. I can explain why he died." The apartment seemed to lose warmth. Nora closed her eyes for 1 second. When she opened them, she was not calmer. Exactly, she was arranged. "Location is mine," she said. "No private office, no car, no men standing near the door pretending not to be yours." "Where?" "Marisola's diner, Pilsen." 40 minutes. "I will be there in 30, I said 40. Another pause. 40, Callum said. Nora hung up. She did not bring the map. That was the first rule her father had taught her about valuable things. Never bring the thing everyone wants to the first meeting. She photographed nothing, copied nothing, and left the map locked inside a hollow space beneath the bottom drawer of her kitchen cabinet. Then she dressed in dark jeans, a thick sweater, boots with good traction, and the long gray coat people sometimes mistook for her attempt to hide herself. It was not. It was warm. It had deep pockets. That was enough. Marisol's diner smelled like coffee, fried eggs, old vinyl seats, and the kind of grease that had outlived 3 generations of bad decisions. Nora chose it because the front windows faced the street. The kitchen had a rear exit, and the morning crowd was mostly regulars who noticed strangers. Callum Kane was already seated in the back booth when she arrived. Of course he was. He stood when she approached, which annoyed her more than if he had stayed seated. Not because courtesy bothered her, but because men like Callum knew courtesy could be used as a weapon. A door held open, a chair pulled out, a soft voice. A woman could be handled gently and still be handled. Nora slid into the booth without waiting for him. There were 2 drinks on the table. Black coffee in front of him, plain hot tea in front of her. She looked at the tea, then at him. "You think knowing what I drink makes you trustworthy?" "No," Callum said. "I thought you would be irritated if I ordered something sweet, because I assumed a woman like you wanted sugar." Nora's face did not change, but something inside her shifted half an inch. It was a small thing, too small to trust, but not too small to notice. "Careful," she said, almost sounded human. "I have my moments. Do not waste them." His mouth moved slightly, not quite a smile. In daylight, Callum looked less like a criminal and more like a man who had learned to make rooms uncertain of themselves. He wore a charcoal overcoat. No jewelry except a plain watch, no visible weapon. His hair was dark with a little gray at the temples. His face was not handsome in a polished way. It was disciplined, controlled, the kind of face that had forgotten how to be surprised. Nora wanted very much to surprise it. "You knew my father," she said. "Yes. How?" "He worked for me." The words landed between them with the weight of something ugly and unavoidable. Nora did not touch the tea. "My father was a cartographer." "He was," Callum said in every sense of the word. "That is not an answer." "No, it is the safest beginning." Nora leaned back. "I did not come here for safe." Callum studied her for a moment. "Your father mapped things that could not be mapped openly. Relationships, money, favors, threats, police protection, political cover. Men who used respectable offices to hide criminal debts. And you. I used those maps to keep certain people alive." Nora laughed once, without humor. That sounds noble for a man everyone in Hargrove is afraid to stand near. I did not say I was noble. Good, I would have left. He accepted that without offense, which bothered her. My brother disappeared 11 years ago, Callum said. He was investigating the same network your father later mapped. Daniel believed if he found enough proof, the law would protect him. And did it? No. The answer was quiet, flat, final. Nora looked down at her hands. She understood grief that had been compressed until it no longer shook. She carried some of it herself. My father died in a robbery, she said. No, Callum replied. The word did not come hard. It came gently, which made it worse. Nora finally touched the tea. Not to drink it, but to give her hands something to do. Tell me. Someone found out what Edmund was building. I do not know who, not yet. The map you found is either bait, a warning, or the first piece of a system he meant you to finish. Her throat tightened. Me. Yes. Why would he do that? Because you can read what no one else can. Nora looked toward the diner window, across the street. A man in a gray parka stood beside a newspaper box. He was not smoking, not checking his phone, not waiting for a bus, just standing. She had seen him before, that morning, outside Hargrove. Her pulse changed, but her face did not. The man across the street, she said. Gray parka. Is he yours? Callum did not turn his head. No. Then we have about 3 minutes before this conversation becomes something else. Now Callum did look at her. You are certain. He has been watching the window reflection, not the door. He thinks I will look for danger directly. He also thinks I will not move quickly. Because of your weight. Because people are lazy thinkers. Callum set money on the table without looking at the bill. Back door, he said. Kitchen hallway, left through the alley. Do exactly what I say. Nora stood. No, his eyes sharpened. She buttoned her coat. I will go first. You follow. If he is watching you, he sees your move. If he is watching me, he underestimates mine. For 1 second, Callum Kane looked truly surprised. Then he nodded. Nora walked toward the kitchen like a woman going to ask for a takeout box. She did not hurry. That was why no one stopped her. Nora walked through the kitchen hallway of Marisol's diner, as if she belonged there. That was a skill she had learned young. If you moved with enough purpose, people rarely questioned you. They might judge your body. They might decide what kind of woman you were before you opened your mouth. But they did not always stop you. Not if you looked like you knew where you were going. A cook in a white apron glanced up from the grill. Restrooms the other way, he said. Not today. Nora replied and kept moving. Behind her, she heard Callum Kane enter the hallway. His footsteps were quiet, but not hesitant. That was the first thing she noticed about the way he moved. He did not rush because he did not believe in wasted motion. Men like him probably learned early that panic attracted witnesses. The back door opened into a narrow alley, glazed with frozen slush. A delivery truck blocked part of the exit. Nora turned left, just as Callum had said, but she did not run. Running made people look. Walking fast made people assume you were late for work. At the mouth of the alley, she caught the reflection of the street in a dark restaurant window. The man in the gray parka had crossed the road. He was moving toward the diner. Nora did not turn her head. She only said, He's inside in 30 seconds. Callum was beside her now. 20. Then you counted later than I did. That almost smile touched his mouth again, but it vanished before it became human. They turned onto 19th Street, then crossed at the light with a group of nurses coming off shift. Nora placed herself between two of them without asking. The women barely noticed. To the man watching from behind, she would become part of a cluster of winter coats, tote bags, tired faces, and hospital shoes. Callum noticed. You use crowds well, he said. I've spent my life being looked at and not seen. There's a difference. He did not answer. A black sedan waited half a block down, engine running, exhaust curling white in the cold. Nora stopped before they reached it. No. Callum looked at her. No. I said no cars. That was before someone followed you. That was before I knew you brought a car. The driver turned his head slightly, but did not get out. Callum studied her for a moment. Most men, Nora knew, disliked being challenged in front of other men. They corrected. They tightened. They smiled like knives. Callum did none of that. He stepped away from the car. Fine. Nora narrowed her eyes. That easy. No, that practical. You will not get in. Standing here arguing makes us visible. He started walking. She followed because he was right. not because he had won. They covered 3 blocks, took a service entrance into a plain brick building, crossed through a lobby that smelled like floor polish, then entered an elevator that required a key Callum produced from nowhere. Nora watched the numbers rise: 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. When the elevator doors opened, she expected velvet furniture, armed men, maybe some ridiculous display of money, gold lamps, marble, a view meant to make visitors feel small. Instead, she found a quiet office with gray walls, clean windows, good lamps, old wood floors, and maps everywhere. Chicago after the Great Fire, Chicago before the expressways, Chicago carved by ward lines, railroads, rivers, school districts, red-lined neighborhoods, shipping corridors, and old immigrant parishes. Some were framed, some were pinned, some were marked with colored thread. Others had notes written in narrow handwriting Nora recognized so sharply it felt like being touched. She forgot Callum for a second. Her father was on those walls, not in photographs, not in memory, in lines, in ink, in the careful pressure of a pen dragged across paper by a hand she had watched at the kitchen table for half her life. Nora stepped closer to one of the maps. It showed the west side in 1972. Empty lots, block clubs, churches, fire damage. A street that no longer existed. Her finger hovered above the lower corner. Edmund Whitaker. He never showed me these, she said. Callum stood near the door, giving her space. He did not want this part of his work near you. Nora laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. People keep saying that like it should comfort me. It was meant to protect you. No. She turned then. Protection is telling someone where the fire exits are. Keeping them blindfolded and calling it safety is something else. For the first time that morning, Callum looked away first. Good, Nora thought. Let it land. She crossed to the large work table in the center of the room. It was not decorative. The surface was scarred with use. There were lamps angled for reading, magnifying lenses, archival weights, cotton gloves, pencils, rulers, and labeled folders arranged with an order that made her chest ache. Her father's order. You use his system, she said. Callum removed his coat and laid it over a chair. He taught me. When? After my brother disappeared. The answer was so direct that Nora did not know where to put it. Callum opened a drawer and took out a blank sheet of heavy paper. You did not bring the map. No, that was correct. I am relieved you approve. I did not say I approved. I said it was correct. Nora hated that some small part of her liked the distinction. She took the chair across from him, but did not sit back. Callum placed several folders on the table between them. Each label was written by hand. Dates, addresses, initials. Nothing obvious enough to incriminate anyone. Everything clear enough to mean something to the person meant to read it. Your father built more than maps, Callum said. He built a language. I know. No, Callum said quietly. You know the family version, bedtime symbols, private jokes, the way he marked your favorite library, or the shop where your mother bought bread. This is different. Nora looked at him for a long moment, then reached into her coat pocket and took out a small notebook. Not the map. Only the notes she had made at dawn. She flipped to a page and turned it toward him. Callum leaned forward. For the first time since she met him, he looked surprised and did not hide it quickly enough. Nora had copied no names, no locations, no full symbols, only fragments, curves, breaks, angles, half marks, enough to test him, not enough to help him without her. She tapped the first sketch. This looks like a rail spur, but it is not transportation. It is money moving through a legitimate business. Callum did not speak. She tapped the second. This one looks like a church marker. It is a witness, not a willing one. My father used steeples for people who were trapped because they had seen something they believed God would punish them for hiding. Callum's eyes lifted to hers. Nora continued. This mark here is not a park. It is a public man with private roots. A politician, probably. Someone who looks clean because the dirt is below the surface. Harlan Mercer. Callum said. I assumed. Do not assume with Mercer, then confirm. Callum got up, crossed to a cabinet, opened the third drawer from the left, counted 6 folders in, and pulled one free without searching. He placed it in front of her. Nora looked at the drawer, then at him. That is exactly how my father organized active reference files. Yes, he trusted you that much. Callum's face changed by almost nothing. But Nora saw it. He trusted the work, he said. That is not what I asked. No, Callum replied. It is the answer I can give, before she could press him. The office door opened and a broad-shouldered man in a navy coat stepped in. He stopped when he saw Nora at the table. Boss, he said. We got a problem with the dock lead. Callum's voice cooled. Russell, this room is closed. Russell glanced at Nora again. Not long, just enough. The kind of glance that weighed, dismissed, and moved on. You sure she should be here for this? Nora felt the old familiar click inside her. Not anger, not yet. Recognition. She looked at Russell's shoes, salt crusted along the outer edge, but not the kind used near Hargrove or Pilsen. Red dust clung to the heel. His left cuff was damp. He smelled faintly of cold river air and cigarette smoke, though his teeth were too clean for a regular smoker. You came from the dock, she said. Russell blinked. What? Not the north office, the dock. You stood near brick dust. Probably under the old loading arch. You smoked with someone, but it was their cigarette, not yours. And you are nervous because you did not expect him to know you went there. Russell's face emptied. Nora turned to Callum. I do not know if that makes him disloyal. But he lied before he opened the door. Silence spread through the room. Callum did not look at Nora. He looked at Russell. Leave us, boss now. Russell left. The door clicked shut. Callum stood very still. Nora closed her notebook. If you are going to bring me into dangerous rooms, Mr. Kane, do not fill them with men who think I am furniture. Callum looked at her then. Fully. I will remember that. No, Nora said. You will correct it. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Callum nodded once. Not politely, not to appease her, as if he had received an order worth obeying. Nora should have felt satisfied. Instead, she felt something more dangerous. Seen. She looked away first, annoyed with herself, and opened the folder marked Mercer. Inside were photographs, bank transfers, charity boards, property records, and 2 missing persons reports. One report had a familiar name written in the margin. Daniel Kane, Callum's brother. Nora read the name, then she read the date. Then she understood why Callum Kane had built an empire out of knowing things. Because once, not knowing had cost him everything. She looked up. Callum's face had gone calm in the way. Deep water looked calm before a body was found beneath it. My father mapped your brother, she said. Callum did not answer. He did not have to. Nora turned the page, and beneath Daniel's name she found a symbol she had not seen since childhood. Her father had used it only for things hidden in pieces. Her pulse slowed. Not from fear, from focus. This is not one location, she said. Callum leaned closer. Nora traced the broken symbol with one finger. It is 7. The room seemed to tighten around them. 7 what? Callum asked. Nora looked at the map fragments, then at the files. Then at the man across from her, who knew almost everything except the thing her father had trusted her to read. 7 hiding places, she said. My father did not leave behind evidence, she swallowed. He left behind a trail. For a long moment after Nora said the word trail, neither of them moved. The office seemed too quiet around them. Outside the windows, Chicago kept going in its usual winter rhythm. Traffic dragging through slush, steam rising from vents. People crossing streets with their heads down against the wind. Inside, everything had narrowed to a table, a folder, a dead man's handwriting. And the 7 pieces of a truth Edmund Whittaker had hidden so well that even Callum Kane had not been able to find it. Callum stood across from her, one hand resting flat on the edge of the table. He was not touching the folder anymore. Nora noticed that. He had the self-control of a man who could make violence look like stillness. But this was different. This was not restraint for strategy. This was grief held in place by discipline. 7 hiding places, he said. Yes, you are sure. Nora looked up at him. Do not ask me that unless you want me to leave. His eyes shifted, just slightly. She expected irritation. Men in power did not like being corrected, especially by women they had not decided to respect yet. She knew the look, the tightening jaw, the small smile, the polite tone that meant, remember your place. Callum did none of those things. You are right, he said. That was the wrong question. It should not have mattered. It was only a sentence. But Nora had lived long enough on the thin edge of other people's assumptions to know when a sentence cost someone pride. Callum had spent years being obeyed, yet he had corrected himself because she had asked him to. That did not make him safe. but it made him less simple. She closed the folder and sat back. Only then did she realize how badly her shoulders hurt. She had been awake nearly 30 hours. Her eyes burned, her feet ached inside her boots. The map, the diner, the alley, Callum S. office. Daniel S. name, the 7 hiding places, all of it had landed in her body at once. Callum noticed. Of course he did. You need food, he said. Nora almost laughed. That is a dangerous thing to say to a woman like me. The words came out lighter than she felt. But the meaning sat between them plainly. Callum did not look embarrassed. He did not rush to apologize in the eager, clumsy way people did when they wanted forgiveness more than understanding. He only said, I meant you have not eaten since before dawn. I would have said the same thing if you were 6 feet tall and built like a linebacker. That almost sounded reasonable. I practice sometimes. Not often enough this time. He did smile, not much. Just enough to change his face before it disappeared again. He moved toward the phone on his desk. What do you eat? Nora watched him carefully. That depends. Are you asking because you want to know? Or because you already know and want me to confirm it? Callum S. hand stopped near the receiver. I know where you buy lunch on Tuesdays, he said. I know you do not like mayonnaise. I know you drink plain tea when you are thinking, and coffee when you are angry. I do not know what you want right now. There it was again. That strange line he walked between invasion and honesty. Nora should have been offended. Part of her was, but another part, the part that had spent years listening to men pretend their guesses were insight, recognized the difference between a man who lied smoothly and one who admitted exactly how far he had gone. Turkey on rye, she said. Mustard. Pickles on the side, no chips. No chips. I did not say I was virtuous. I said no chips. He ordered without commenting, while they waited. Nora rose and walked to the wall of maps. Her father's work surrounded her in layers: rail yards, old ward boundaries, churches, shuttered factories, public housing sites, river routes. She had grown up thinking Edmund Whittaker mapped places. Now she understood he had mapped consequences. Every street on these walls was attached to a person, every property line to a decision, every blank area to something someone had wanted forgotten. He loved people by recording what happened to them. Nora said quietly. Callum looked over from the desk. She had not meant to speak aloud, but there was no taking it back. My father was not good with speeches, she continued. Birthdays, apologies, comfort, he was terrible at all of it. But if you mentioned a house your grandmother lived in 40 years ago, he would find the old address, the census record, the original property line, and 3 photographs of the block before the city tore it up. Callum leaned against the desk. That sounds like him. You say that like you knew him well. I knew the part of him that came here. Nora turned. Was that the real part? Callum was quiet for a moment. I do not know. Men like your father kept rooms inside themselves. I was allowed into one of them. That answer hurt more than a lie would have, because it sounded true. The food arrived 20 minutes later, brought up by a man who did not enter until Callum gave permission. He placed the bag on the side table and left without looking directly at Nora. She wondered if that was discipline or fear. In Callum S. world, the two probably wore the same coat. They ate at the work table because neither of them suggested moving. For the first few minutes, there was only paper rustling and the muted noise of traffic below. Nora had expected Callum to eat like a man too busy to taste anything. But he did not. He ate carefully, not slowly, exactly, attentively, like food deserved the same respect as information. She hated that she noticed. Halfway through the sandwich, her phone rang. Jake. Nora's whole body changed before she could stop it. Callum saw. His eyes moved to the screen. Then away, she answered. Hey, you alive? Jake asked. His voice was bright, young, familiar in a way that made her chest tighten. I texted you twice. I am alive. I am also working. You always say that. One day I am going to call and some dusty museum ghost is going to answer. Archive ghost, Nora said. Museums display things. Archives judge people silently. Jake laughed. That sounds like you. Callum lowered his gaze to the folder, giving her the illusion of privacy. Nora knew better than to believe he was not hearing every word. Still, she appreciated the effort. Jake talked about his thesis advisor. Boston weather, a fight with his girlfriend that did not sound like a fight, and whether Nora could come visit next month. She gave the right answers at the right times. Warm, normal, sisterly. She did not mention maps, dead fathers, mafia bosses, or the fact that Jake's city had just appeared in a code their father had built before his death. When she hung up, the office felt colder. He does not know, Callum said. Nora put the phone face down. No, he may need to. Eventually is not today. That is what your father thought. The sentence struck clean. Nora turned on him. Careful. I am not accusing you. No, you are comparing me to a dead man who lied to protect his children. Callum accepted the blow without flinching. Yes, for a second. Nora wanted to hate him. It would have been easier. But the terrible thing was that he was not wrong. She was doing to Jake what Edmund had done to her, keeping the map in her own hands, carrying the fear alone, calling it love because love sounded better than control. She looked away first. Callum did not press. That was wise of him. They worked again after that, slower now. Nora decoded fragments. Callum matched them to files. A church on the south side, a closed law office, a bank deposit box under a company name that had not existed since 1998, a cemetery where Nora's mother was buried. Each location unfolded like a locked room in Edmund's mind. Then Nora found Daniel's name again, not in the main line, in the margin, hidden beneath a symbol that looked like a bridge. She touched it gently. My father knew more about your brother than he told you. Callum's face went still. What does it say? Nora read the symbols twice before answering. She did not want to be wrong. Not about this. It says Daniel was moved after he disappeared. The room changed. Callum did not speak. He did not sit. He did not ask the question that filled the space between them. Alive. Nora could not give him that. Not yet. It does not say where, she said softly. Only that the river was not the end of the trail. Callum turned toward the window. His reflection looked older in the glass. For the first time since Nora had met him, he seemed less like a man who knew every secret in the city and more like a brother who had been waiting 11 years for a door to open. Nora stood beside the table, unsure what to do with her hands. In the end, she did not touch him. She only said, "No one should have to read that alone." Callum closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, his voice was very quiet. Your father was thorough. Yes, Nora said. He loved that way. They worked until evening pressed blue against the windows. By then, Nora's notes filled 6 pages, and Callum's perfect files had begun to look less perfect. The map was not only changing what they knew, it was changing the shape of the room. Nora was putting on her coat when Callum's phone buzzed. He read the message once, then again. The softness, what little there had been, vanished from his face. What is it? Nora asked. Callum looked at her. Someone broke into Hargrove last night. Her hand tightened on the coat button. Was anything taken? No. That was worse. Nora knew it before he said the rest. They were in the basement, Callum continued, near your archive shelves. Nora reached for her bag, Callum said. I am coming with you. She looked at him then, tired, frightened, and very clear. No, she said, you are coming after me. His eyes narrowed. Nora opened the office door. It is my archive. Nora reached Hargrove before Callum. She did not do it to prove anything. Proving things to men was a young woman's game, and Nora had gotten tired of it somewhere around 30. After the 1,000th person confused her patience with permission. She arrived first because Hargrove was hers. Its basement, its shelves, its bad lighting. Its stubborn elevator that hesitated between floors like it was reconsidering its life choices. All of it belonged to her in a way no title or paycheck could explain. The front doors were still locked when she got there. Phil Turner opened them from inside, wearing his old Navy security jacket and the expression of a man who had not slept enough but would rather chew glass than admit it. You shouldn't be here alone, he said. I am not alone. You here, that is not what I meant, I know. Phil sighed and stepped aside. Mr. Kane called. Of course he did, said not to let you go downstairs until he arrived. Nora stopped in the lobby and looked at him. Phil's face changed before she said a word. He had known her long enough to understand the mistake. Right, he muttered. Forgot who I was talking to. People do. She moved past him toward the stairwell. The elevator would have been easier on her knees, especially after the long day before. But Nora wanted the stairs, not for pride, for sound. Elevators swallowed noise. Stairwells carried it. If anyone was still inside the building, she wanted to hear them before they heard her. The basement smelled wrong, that was the first thing. Not dramatically wrong, not smoke, not blood, not the sharp chemical bite of forced entry. Just wrong enough. Cold air from the loading dock, damp wool, a trace of mud that did not belong to any staff member she knew. Nora stood at the bottom of the stairs and listened. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Pipes knocked somewhere inside the walls. Nothing moved. She took 3 steps forward and began to read the room. Box 12F was out of line by less than 2 inches. The drawer below municipal permits had been closed with too much force, pushing the label slightly crooked. A rolling ladder had been moved from bay 4 to bay 6, but whoever moved it had locked only one wheel. The security camera above the west shelf was angled differently. Not enough for Phil to notice on a monitor, but enough to give someone a narrow blind spot near the donated collections. Nora's heartbeat slowed. Fear liked to run. Work made it sit down. She crossed to the shelf where the donated box had been the night before. The spot was empty now because she had processed the contents, but the dust around it had been disturbed. Someone had touched the shelf after her. Someone who did not know how careful she was. Behind her, the stairwell door opened. Callum came down with Phil 2 steps behind him. Callum wore the same dark calm he had worn in his office. But his eyes moved differently here, faster, sharper. He was measuring exits, corners, hiding places, lines of sight. Nora did not turn around. "You late," she said. "I was told you would wait upstairs. You were misinformed." Phil gave Callum a look that said he had tried. Callum looked at the shelves, then at Nora. For once, he did not begin with an order. "What do you see?" 3 words, simple words. But Nora heard what they cost him. Men like Callum did not ask questions when they preferred control. Yet he was asking, not pretending to ask, not flattering, asking. So she answered. Someone entered through the loading dock, not the main stairwell. The camera was shifted to create a blind spot near Bay 5. They were looking for the donated box from South Halstead, but they did not know I had already removed the map. They checked municipal permits because my father used property records as covers. They were careful, but not archival careful. Callum's gaze moved where hers had already been. "How many?" "1." Phil frowned. "You can tell that." Nora pointed at the floor. 1 set of mud tracks. Size 11, maybe 12. Heavy on the right heel. He stood here longer than anywhere else, which means this shelf mattered. He knew enough to search, but not enough to understand what he was seeing. Callum's mouth tightened. "A professional." "No," Nora said. "Someone working for one." A sound came from the far end of the basement, paper sliding. Nora turned. Amelia Brooks stood near Bay 7, holding a stack of folders against her chest. She was 26, pretty in a restless way, with glossy hair and a voice that always sounded like it was trying to be liked. 2 months earlier, Nora had heard Amelia laughing in the break room, telling Dennis that Nora probably remembered every shelf because she had nothing else going on in her life. Nora had said nothing then. Now Amelia looked pale. "I came down to pull the zoning files," she said. "I didn't know anyone was." Nora saw the bolt before Amelia finished speaking. The tall metal shelf behind her leaned no more than an inch forward. To anyone else, it would have looked normal. To Nora, who had balanced her life around the exactness of heavy things, it looked like a held breath before collapse. One of the anchor bolts had been cut almost through. "Amelia," Nora said, her voice low, "step away from the shelf." Amelia blinked. "What now?" The shelf screamed. It began so slowly at first, metal complaining against concrete, then all at once, boxes shifted. A row of ledgers slid forward. Amelia froze, eyes wide, body locked in the path of several 100 pounds of steel and paper. Callum moved, but he was too far away. Phil swore. Nora did not think. Thinking would have wasted time. She crossed the space in 3 hard steps and drove her shoulder into the side of the falling shelf. Pain burst through her upper arm and across her back, white and immediate. Her boots slipped against the concrete, but she dropped her weight low, braced 1 foot behind her, and shoved with everything she had. The shelf did not stop, but it slowed. "Enough! Move!" Nora shouted. Amelia dropped to the floor and crawled, sobbing, as ledgers rained down around her. One struck Nora's hip, another hit her forearm. She heard Callum reach the shelf beside her. felt Phil's weight join from the other side, and together they pushed the metal frame back, just far enough for it to slam against the adjacent shelving instead of crushing the girl beneath it. Then silence fell, real silence, not the basement's usual quiet. This was shock. This was everyone in the room understanding that a death had just been argued with and postponed. Nora stood bent forward, one hand gripping the shelf, her breath coming hard. Her shoulder felt like fire. Amelia sat on the floor shaking. "Nora," she whispered. "Oh my God. Nora, I'm so sorry." Nora looked down at the scattered documents around her boots. "If you re going to apologize," she said, still breathing hard. "Start by keeping your tears off the paper." For half a second, no one moved. Then Phil gave a strangled laugh, the kind that came from terror more than humor. Amelia cried harder, but she began gathering folders with trembling hands. Callum was looking at Nora, not at the shelf, not at the mess. At her. People had looked at Nora's body all her life, too much body. Not enough discipline, too heavy, not fast enough, too large, too visible, too easy to dismiss. They had looked and decided they knew what it meant. Callum looked now and saw what it had done. Her body had become leverage, her weight had become anchor. Her strength had bought another woman enough seconds to live. The title of her life, the one strangers had written without asking, had just turned against them. "You re-hurt," Callum said. Nora released the shelf slowly. "Isotis, let me see, are you a doctor?" "No." "Then call one." He did, immediately. No argument. No male pride dressed as concern. He took out his phone and called someone who answered on the first ring. That, more than the fear in his eyes, told Nora he was learning. 20 minutes later, a doctor with a leather bag and no questions examined Nora in the staff office. Nothing broken, deep bruising, strained shoulder. She would hurt for days. Nora accepted the verdict with the grim relief of someone who did not have time for worse news. Callum waited outside the door. When she came out, he did not ask if she was all right. That would have been foolish. He had watched her ram herself into a falling shelf. Instead, he said, "Whoever did this wanted it to look like an accident. Yes. They did not expect you to notice. No, they did not expect you to move toward it." Nora looked at him. No one ever does. By late afternoon, Callum took her to meet Margaret Doyle. The laundromat was on the north side, wedged between a check-cashing place and a closed bakery. Inside, machines turned slowly behind fogged glass. Margaret Doyle sat at a folding table near the back, drinking coffee from a paper cup and reading a newspaper like it had personally disappointed her. She was in her 50s, broad-shouldered, gray-haired, and unimpressed by the sight of Callum Kane. "So," she said, looking at Nora, "Edmund's girl." Nora stiffened. "You knew my father." "Everybody who mattered knew your father. Most of them were smart enough to be scared of what he remembered." Callum stood beside Nora, silent. Margaret studied Nora for a long moment, not with pity, not with judgment, with recognition. "Your father said you were the strongest one in the family." Nora gave a tired smile. "He meant Jake. Jake played football." Margaret shook her head. "No, he said Jake could run fast. You could stand long." The words went into Nora quietly and stayed there. Margaret leaned back. "The man who went into Hargrove was not looking for paper. He was looking for the person who could read it. That means he was looking for you." Outside, the winter evening had turned the city blue. Callum walked Nora to the curb, but did not touch her. "There is something else," he said. She already hated the sound of that. "What?" "The donated box was not random. Edmund arranged for it to reach Hargrove after his death. Specifically your department, specifically your shift." Nora stared at him. "He knew he was going to die. He knew someone would come, and he chose me." Callum's voice softened. "Yes." Nora looked away, jaw tight. "Or he used me." "No," Callum said. "He trusted you." Before she could answer, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. A photo message appeared. A postcard. Boston Public Library. On the back, written in black ink, was one sentence. "Your brother is easier to reach than you are." Nora's injured shoulder throbbed. The pain suddenly felt very far away. Callum saw her face and stepped closer. "Nora." She turned the phone toward him. For the first time since she had known him, Callum Kane looked truly afraid. For 3 seconds, Nora could not hear the city. Cars moved somewhere behind her. A bus sighed at the curb. The laundromat windows rattled in the wind. and an old woman carrying a bag of folded clothes passed close enough to brush Nora's sleeve. The world kept making its ordinary noises, but none of them reached her clearly. All she could see was the postcard on her phone. Boston Public Library. Your brother is easier to reach than you are. Jake had sent her a picture from that library 2 weeks ago. He had been sitting under one of the green reading lamps, grinning into the camera, his hair sticking up on one side because he always forgot to check mirrors when he was excited. He had written, "Thesis prison, send snacks." Nora had laughed when she got it. Now the same building looked like a threat. She felt Callum step closer, but he did not touch her, a day ago. She might not have noticed the restraint. Now she did. He was a man who could have men followed, phones traced, doors opened, and cars moved with a sentence. But in that moment, with Nora standing there injured and terrified, he did not take the phone from her hand. He waited. That mattered. She hated that it mattered. "Is he safe?" she asked. Callum's eyes were already on his own phone, his thumb moving once, twice, no wasted motion. "I am checking." "That is not an answer." "No," he said. "It is the step before one." She almost snapped at him, but the honesty stopped her. Panic wanted a promise. Nora had never trusted promises made too quickly. 30 seconds later, Callum's phone buzzed. He read the message. "Jake is in his apartment," he said. "Campus security saw him enter at 5:42 Eastern. One of my people is outside the building now. No contact has been made." Nora looked up sharply. "One of your people?" "Yes. You were already watching my brother." Callum did not soften the truth. From a distance. Something inside Nora went cold. "Without asking me. If I had asked, you would have said no. That does not make it better." "No," he said quietly. "It makes it true." The anger came then, hot enough to cut through fear. "You do not get to turn everyone I love into one of your files." Callum's face tightened, but he did not argue. That, more than anything, told Nora she had hit something real. "I am keeping him alive," he said. "No," Nora answered. "You are controlling the danger around him and calling it protection. Those are not always the same thing." For a moment, he looked away. Nora was too tired to enjoy being right. They returned to Callum's office just after dark. The city below had turned hard and silver. Glass towers reflecting the last thin light of winter. Nora's shoulder throbbed every time she moved. And the doctor's warning about rest seemed like advice from a nicer planet. The map fragments were waiting on the table. Callum had not touched them. That surprised her. He saw the glance. "They are yours." "No," Nora said, lowering herself into the chair. "They are my father's, and he left them to you." She did not answer. Because that was the part she still did not know how to carry. They worked in silence for nearly an hour. Nora decoded while Callum cross-referenced records. The 7 locations grew clearer with each mark she translated. Hargrove. A South Side church. A closed law office. A bank deposit box under a dead company's name. A Boston library. Marcus Webb's abandoned house. And finally, Rose Hill Cemetery, where Nora's mother had been buried when Nora was 16. She stared at that last symbol longer than the others. Callum noticed, "Of course, your mother." "Yes." "Did Edmund use family places often?" "No," Nora said. "That is why it matters." The room settled around the answer. Callum ordered dinner sometime after 8. Not sandwiches this time. Pierogi, roast chicken, cabbage, dark bread, and soup from a Polish restaurant on the west side. Nora recognized the smell before he opened the containers. "My father loved this place," she said. "I know." She looked at him. Callum set the food on the table carefully. "He took me there once. After Daniel disappeared. I did not eat much. He told me grief was arrogant because it convinced a man his body no longer needed ordinary things." "That sounds like him." "He was right, he usually was," Nora said. Then, after a moment, "Except when he was not." Callum sat across from her. "You are angry with him." "Yes, and you miss him." "Yes, and both are true." Nora looked down at her bowl of soup. Steam rose between them. "People do not like letting daughters be angry at dead fathers." "I am not people." "No," she said. "You are something else." He almost smiled. "That was not a compliment. It was not an insult either. I am still organizing you." For the first time that day, some of the pressure in the room loosened. They ate without talking for a while. Nora noticed Callum did not comment on what she ate, how much she ate, whether she finished, whether she wanted bread. He simply passed the container when she reached for it. The quiet decency of that felt almost unbearable. Later, Callum's phone rang. He looked at the screen and stood. The change in him was immediate. Not panic, never that. But the softer edges disappeared. He crossed to the window and answered with one word, talk. Nora watched him listen. Then he began moving people like pieces on a board. A family on Cicero Avenue was told to leave through the back door. A driver was rerouted. A bank account was frozen. Someone named Martin was ordered not to be brave, which somehow sounded like the most serious instruction of all. The calls lasted 7 minutes. When they were over, Callum stood with one hand against the window frame, looking down at the city he had spent years trying to know before it could hurt him. One of yours? Nora asked. Yes, safe. For now. She stood and came beside him, leaving a careful space between them. You do this all the time, not always this loudly. That is not what I meant. He was quiet for a long moment. I have been doing this alone for 11 years. Alone is cleaner, faster, no explanations, no one standing close enough to see the cost. And now, he turned his head toward her. Now you are in the room. And I am beginning to worry about the decisions I make when no one is. Nora felt the words more than she wanted to. Her hand rested on the edge of the table. Callum's hand was near it. He did not reach for her. He waited, as if waiting had become the first honest thing he could offer. Nora did not move away. After a moment, his fingers touched hers. Lightly, questioning, she let them stay. No promise passed between them, no confession, no kiss, just two people standing in a room full of maps. Both understanding that being seen was more dangerous than being followed. Later, after Callum insisted on sending a car, she refused, and then settled for having Phil drive her in his old Buick. Nora returned to her apartment with her shoulder aching and her mind too full for sleep. She had just locked the door when her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost did not answer. Then she did. Marcus Webb's voice came through thin and unsteady. Miss Whitaker. There is something Callum Kane did not tell you. Nora stood in the dark kitchen, one hand still on the deadbolt. Marcus breathed once, hard, 1 week before your father died. Callum received a warning. He knew someone was going to be killed. Nora's body went still, Marcus said. He just did not tell Edmund. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the sound of every map in Nora's life-changing shape at once. Nora did not sleep after Marcus Webb's call. There were nights when fear made a person restless, made them pace, cry, search drawers, check locks, call someone just to hear a living voice. Nora did none of that. She stood in her dark kitchen with the phone still in her hand, staring at the table where her father's map had been spread only hours earlier. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. Even the radiator seemed to hold its breath. 1 week before your father died, Callum received a warning. He knew someone was going to be killed. He just did not tell Edmund. The words did not explode inside her. They settled. That was worse. Explosions ended. Settling became part of the room. Nora thought of Callum standing beside her at the window, his fingers touching hers with that careful restraint, his voice saying he worried about the decisions he made when no one was in the room. She thought of him ordering food without judgment, listening when she spoke, calling a doctor without argument, looking at her after she saved Amelia, as if he had finally understood something the world had missed. Then she thought of her father alone in his apartment, the searched drawers, the replaced lock, the police report closed too fast. She pressed one hand against the edge of the kitchen counter until the wood bit into her palm. By morning, she had made a decision. Marcus Webb agreed to meet at Humboldt Park just after sunrise. The sky was low and gray, the trees black against the snow. Marcus sat on a bench near the frozen lagoon, wearing a brown coat that looked too thin for the weather. He was older than Nora expected. Not old in a harmless way. Old like a man who had spent years carrying a truth he never had the courage to use. He stood when she approached. Miss Whitaker, sit down, Nora said. He sat. She remained standing. Marcus looked at her face and seemed to understand that there would be no warm beginning. I should have come to you sooner. Yes. The answer landed hard enough to make him lower his eyes. Your father was my friend, he said. Then speak carefully. Marcus swallowed. A week before Edmund died, Callum received a warning through one of his channels. It said someone connected to the mapping work was going to be eliminated. Callum believed the target was inside his own organization. He moved protection around 3 people. But not my father. No. Why? Because the warning mentioned a ledger route your father had not used in months. Callum thought it pointed elsewhere. Nora stared at him. And after my father died. Marcus looked out at the frozen water. He knew he might have read it wrong. Might have, yes, and he never told me. Marcus did not answer fast enough. Nora laughed once. It was a small sound, dry and empty. Men like you always think silence is softer than truth. I was afraid, I know. That made him look at her. Nora's voice stayed calm. That is not forgiveness. It is just identification. Marcus flinched. Good, she thought. Let it hurt somewhere besides me. She went straight from the park to Callum's office. Phil was not at the door this time. Another man opened it, recognized her, and stepped aside too quickly. Nora wondered what Callum had told them about her. Maybe nothing, maybe enough. Either way, no one tried to stop her. Callum was at the table when she entered, sleeves rolled up, Edmund S. files open in front of him. He looked up. And, for half a second, his face changed. He knew. That was the worst part. He knew before she spoke. Nora closed the door behind her. Did you receive a warning before my father died? Callum did not move. The silence lasted less than a breath. It was enough. Yes, he said. Nora felt something inside her go very still. Tell me. The warning was vague. It came through a source that had been unreliable twice before. It mentioned a route we had not used in months. I believed the threat was aimed at me, or at someone close to me. So you protected your people, yes, and my father died, yes. The simplicity of it nearly broke her. Not because it was cruel, because it was honest in the way a blade was honest. Nora stepped closer to the table. After he died, did you suspect the warning had been about him? Callum looked at her. Yes, there it was, no place to hide now. You let me sit in this room, she said. Read my father's maps, tell you things I had not told anyone. Stand beside you while you heard about your brother. And all that time you knew, you might have been able to save him. I did not know for certain. No, Nora said, but you knew enough to wonder and you did not tell me. Callum's jaw tightened. If I had told you. You might have walked away before the map was decoded. For a moment, Nora could not speak, because that was not an excuse, it was worse. It was the truth. At least that is honest, she said softly. He looked down. Nora had imagined anger would feel louder. Instead, it felt cold and clean. You did not lie because you are evil, she said. You lied because you thought the mission mattered more than my right to know. That kind of thinking is what makes men like you dangerous. Before Callum could answer, the office door opened. A man Nora recognized from the hall stepped in, pale and tense. Boss, Boston. Nora's blood turned sharp. Callum stood. What happened? Mercer's people approached the library, one man inside. One outside Jake Whitaker's apartment. Nora reached for the table. Callum was already moving. 3 phone calls, no raised voice, no wasted word. Jake was pulled from the library by a campus security officer who thought he was responding to a fire alarm. The man outside his apartment was redirected by Boston police after an anonymous weapons tip. A safe location was opened under a different name. A driver Callum trusted was sent, then cancelled when Nora's eyes cut toward him, and replaced with university security instead. 5 minutes later, Jake was safe, alive, confused, angry, safe. Callum ended the last call and turned to her. Nora could barely breathe. He had saved Jake. That was the cruelty of it. Callum Kane was not a monster. A monster would have been easier to leave behind. Callum could do the right thing. He could act fast, think clearly, protect someone she loved. And still, he had betrayed her. Thank you, she said. His face changed as if those 2 words hurt. Nora, I am thanking you for Jake. Not forgiving you for my father. I know. She picked up her coat from the chair. Her shoulders screamed when she moved, but she welcomed the pain. It was simple. It made sense. Callum took 1 step forward, then stopped himself. Good, Nora thought. You are learning too late. I should have told you, he said. Yes, I am sorry. She looked at him then. I believe you know pain, Callum. I believe you know guilt. I even believe there are people you would die to protect. Her voice lowered. But I do not know if you know how to respect someone enough to tell him the truth when the truth might cost you what you want. He had no answer. That was the first decent thing he had done all morning. Nora opened the door. The map is decoded enough for you to continue, she said. You have what you needed. That is not all I needed. She did not turn around. Good night, Callum. It was morning, but neither of them corrected it. The door closed behind her. Callum stood alone in the office, surrounded by maps, files, evidence, and all the knowledge he had spent 11 years collecting. For the first time in a long time, none of it helped him. On the table, Nora's unfinished tea had gone cold beside Edmund Whittaker's map. Callum looked at it and understood, with perfect clarity, that some people did not leave because they were weak. They left because they had finally remembered they deserved better. 3 days passed before Nora touched the map again, not because she had stopped caring, not because she had forgiven anyone, not because the danger had become smaller while she stayed home with the curtains drawn and her injured shoulder wrapped beneath an old sweater. She touched nothing because there were moments in life when a person had to let the pain become quiet enough to hear the truth underneath it. Callum Kane had lied to her. No, not lied. Nora corrected herself each time the word appeared. He had hidden the truth. People loved making those two things sound different. In her experience, the body did not know the difference. Betrayal sat in the ribs either way. Her father was dead. Callum had received a warning. He had misread it then. When Nora came into his office, carrying the one thing Edmund had left behind, Callum had decided she could be useful before she had the right to be fully informed. That was the part she could not stop returning to. Not the mistake. Mistakes were human, horrible, costly, unforgivable sometimes, but human. It was the calculation after. The decision that her ignorance served the mission. Nora knew men like that. Men who called control protection. Men who called silence mercy. Men who thought a woman was safer when she knew less, then acted wounded when she did not thank them for the cage. Her father had done it too. That thought hurt so badly she avoided it for almost an hour. On the third morning, Nora made tea she did not drink, took 2 painkillers for her shoulder, and pulled the map from its hiding place beneath the bottom kitchen drawer. She spread it across the table and placed her father's old brass compass on the corner. The 7 locations stared back at her. Hargrove, the Southside Church, the closed law office, the bank box, the Boston Library, Marcus Webb's house, Rose Hill Cemetery. She could have called Callum. She did not. She could have called Jake and told him everything. She did not do that either. Not yet. Instead, she took a cab to St. Bartholomew's Church on the south side. The church stood between a boarded grocery store and a row of brick 2-flats with iron fences and snow packed along the steps. Its stone face was blackened by weather, and one of the front doors had a crack running through the paint. It did not look like the kind of place that held a secret powerful men would kill for. That made sense. Her father had always trusted overlooked places. Inside, the air smelled of wax, old wood, and cold stone. A few candles burned near a statue of Mary. Somewhere in the back, a radiator knocked like a tired heart. An elderly priest appeared from a side door, small and thin, with silver hair and eyes that still paid attention. "Can I help you?" he asked. Nora removed her gloves. "I am looking for something my father may have left here." His name was Edmund Whittaker. The priest's expression changed. Not fear, recognition. "You are Nora." She was used to people knowing her father. She was not used to them knowing her. "Yes." The priest looked at her for a long moment, then nodded toward the back of the church. He said you might come one day. The basement archive beneath St. Bartholomew's was colder than Hargrove and far less organized. Nora would have been annoyed by it under different circumstances. Baptism records sat beside maintenance receipts. Marriage ledgers leaned against boxes of Christmas decorations. A filing cabinet labeled 1,000, 971,000. 978 contained nothing from the 70s and 2 folders from 1,000. 991. The priest apologized. Nora almost smiled. "I have seen worse." That was not true. But kindness did not always require accuracy. He led her to a metal cabinet near the far wall. "Your father helped us catalog old parish maps years ago. He asked me to keep one envelope sealed unless you came for it." How did he know I would? He said you were the only person he knew who would find the question inside the answer. Nora looked away before the priest could see her face clearly. The envelope was taped beneath the bottom drawer. Of course it was. Edmund loved hiding important things below places where impatient people stopped looking. Inside was a thin stack of photocopied records, a key, and a folded note. Nora opened the note first. Her father's handwriting crossed the page in careful blue ink. Nora sees what others dismiss. That will save her one day. It may also save people she has never met. If she is reading this, I have asked too much of her. I know that, but I have never mistaken her quiet for weakness. The world will. Let them. Their mistake will give her time. Nora sat down on an old wooden chair because her knees had become unreliable. For most of her life, people had made her body the first fact about her. Her father had not ignored that. He had seen it. He had seen what the world did with it. And he had believed the very thing others dismissed might become cover. Armor, patience, weapon, shelter. She pressed the note to her chest once, briefly, then folded it with care. She did not forgive him, but she understood 1 more inch of him. That would have to be enough for the morning. Across the city, Callum Kane sat alone in his office and did not open the file he had created under Nora Whitaker's name. It sat on his screen, blank except for the title. He had built an empire by filling blank spaces, names, dates, habits, weaknesses, debts, medical records, parking tickets, patterns of movement, former lovers, favorite restaurants, men who could be turned, women who could be threatened, children who needed protection. Information had saved lives. Information had also become the way he kept people far enough away to manage. Nora had seen that faster than anyone. You do not get to turn everyone I love into one of your files. Callum closed the laptop. The room felt different without her in it, less difficult, less alive. Marcus Webb arrived just after noon, nervous and damp from the snow. Callum let him stand in front of the desk for a full minute before speaking. "If you came to ask whether she hates me," Callum said, "I do not need you to answer." Marcus rubbed a gloved hand over his mouth. Edmund knew you would fail him in some way. Callum's eyes lifted. Marcus looked frightened, but he continued, "Not the warning specifically, not that. But he knew you carried too much power and trusted information more than people. He still worked with you. That is supposed to comfort me. No, it is supposed to tell you the truth. Edmund did not trust you because you were clean. He trusted you because he believed you could still choose right after doing wrong." Callum said nothing. Marcus' voice softened. "And Nora does not need you to become a good man overnight. She needs you to stop deciding for her." After Marcus left, Callum remained seated for a long time. Then he did something his instincts hated. Nothing. He did not send men to follow Nora into the church. He did not call the priest. He did not break into traffic cameras. He did not open the file and start typing everything he knew about her. He let the blank remain blank. It felt, absurdly, like standing unarmed. That afternoon, Nora called Jake. He answered on the third ring, breathless. "Hey, please tell me this is not about another fake fire alarm. Yesterday was weird." Nora closed her eyes. "Jake, I need to tell you something. Not everything, not yet, but enough." The silence on the line changed. She told him their father had not died in a simple robbery. She told him Edmund had been involved in dangerous work. She told him people might be looking for things he left behind. She did not tell him about Callum. Not yet. She did not tell him about Mercer. But she told enough to stop lying. Jake was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You were trying to protect me." "Yes, I know." His voice shook. "But you do not have to protect me from becoming an adult." Nora pressed her fingers to her eyes. There it was again. The shape of the lesson. Returning through someone she loved. By evening, Hargrove called. The Institute had received a formal demand for all materials related to Edmund Whitaker. The request came dressed in legal language. But Nora heard the threat inside it. Senator Mercer was moving through official channels now. If the documents left Hargrove, they would vanish into a government room with no windows and no memory. Nora went to the emergency board meeting with her shoulder aching and her father's note folded in her pocket. The board members looked at her differently that night. Not kindly, not yet, but desperately. Nora stood at the end of the polished table and laid out the facts. Chain of custody, donor restrictions, historical classification, legal delay, public accountability. She spoke for 12 minutes without raising her voice. When one board member asked if she was certain, Nora looked at him until he looked away. "You hired me to know where things belong," she said. "Those records belong here." After the meeting, she stepped into the hallway and found Callum waiting near the exit. He did not move toward her. "Smart man, I saw what you did," he said. Nora adjusted the strap of her bag. "Did you? You saved the institute." She looked at him for a long moment. "Do not turn that into a compliment unless you understand it is the truth." Callum nodded once. "I understand." It was not forgiveness. But Nora did not walk away immediately, and for that night, that was the only mercy either of them had earned. Nora returned to Callum Kane's office on a Saturday morning without calling first. She told herself that was not dramatic. People called before they visited friends. They called before they visited family. They called before they visited people who had earned the right to expect them. Callum had not earned that. Not yet. So Nora took the elevator to the 14th floor, her shoulders still stiff beneath her coat. Her father's note folded in her pocket, and the second piece of evidence locked inside her bag. Phil Turner was not there this time, but the man at the private entrance recognized her and opened the door without asking a question. That told her enough. Callum's people had been warned not to stop her. Good, she thought. At least he could learn. Callum was in the map room when she entered. He stood at the long table with a book open in front of him. Not a file, not a report, but an old history of Chicago cartography. A pencil rested beside his hand. There were notes in the margin, careful and spare. Nora noticed the title before she noticed his face. Her father would have owned that book. Callum looked up. He did not smile. He did not say her name like a plea. He did not act relieved. Though something in his stillness told her he was. "Nora," he said. "I have two conditions." Callum closed the book. "Tell me." She stayed near the door. That mattered. She wanted him to see that she had not come back because the room belonged to him. She had come back because the work mattered, and because she had decided to. "First," she said, "if you've received information that affects my safety or Jake's, you tell me immediately. Not after you weigh the mission, not after you decide what I can handle. Immediately." Agreed. "Second, when this is over, I want everything. My father Daniel, Mercer Marcus Webb. Your part in all of it. Not the useful version, not the kind version, the whole thing." Callum was quiet. "That will not be gentle," he said. "I am not weak. Callum, I am tired of people behaving like I will shatter if the truth touches me." Something moved through his face then. Shame, maybe, or respect. Nora did not soften because of it. "Agreed," he said. "I have not forgiven you. I am not asking you to." "Good, if you had. I would have left." That almost made him smile. Not because it was funny. Because it was true, and they both knew it. Nora crossed the room and placed the church envelope on the table. "My father hid this at St. Bartholomew's. There is a key inside. I think it opens the deposit box listed under the dead company." Callum did not touch it right away. He looked at her first. "You went alone." "Yes, I know." Her eyes hardened. "I did not follow you," he said. "I wanted to. I assumed that was difficult for you. It was unpleasant." "Good. This time." The almost smile reached his eyes before disappearing. "There is something else. Marcus Webb's old house was watched last night. Mercer's people think the next piece is there. Then we go before they find it." Callum hesitated, only briefly. "It may be unsafe." Nora looked at him until he understood the mistake. He corrected himself. "It will be unsafe. Are you coming?" "Yes." They reached Marcus Webb's abandoned house just before dusk. The place sat on a narrow street with half the porch sagging and newspapers rotting against the front steps. One of Callum's men glanced at Nora as they approached. Maybe she should wait in the car. Nora did not look at Callum. She looked at the house. "It was built in 1912, she said. Houses from that period often had coal access doors in the basement. If Mercer's men block the front and rear exits, that may be the only way out." The man blinked. Callum said, "She comes in, inside." The house smelled of dust, wet plaster, and old fear. Nora found the false wall behind a collapsed pantry shelf because her father had marked the house on the map not by address, but by original floor plan. Behind the plaster was a metal box wrapped in oilcloth. Then tires rolled over gravel outside. Callum's men moved fast, too fast. The rear door was chained from the outside. The front window filled with shadows. Callum began giving orders. Nora listened for 3 seconds, then cut in. "No, basement." One of his men snapped. "That is a dead end." "No," Nora said. "It is the way out." Callum turned toward her. 10 seconds passed in his eyes. 10 seconds where old instinct fought new trust. Then he said, basement. They found the coal access door, behind a rotted board, and crawled through into the alley as Mercer's men broke through the front. Snow fell hard enough to blur the streetlights. Nora slipped once, and Callum caught her elbow, then released her the moment she was steady. In the car, no one spoke for a full minute. Finally, Callum said, "You saved my life." Nora looked out at the dark street. "I know, I am not saying that to convince you of your value," he said. "I am saying it because it is true." She turned then. "Not much, just enough." Then I heard it. Back at the office, Nora opened the metal box. Inside were bank records, photographs, and a folded page in Edmund S. handwriting. On it was a short list titled, "People Worth Protecting, Nora, Jake, Daniel, Callum." Callum stared at his own name as if it had been written in blood. "My father was not saying you were innocent," Nora said softly. "He was saying you were worth pulling out of the dark." Callum's voice was low. "And what do you think?" Nora held his gaze. "I think a man is only worth pulling out if he is willing to step." Before he could answer, his phone buzzed. He read the message. And the room changed around them. "Mercer is hosting a fundraiser tomorrow night," he said. "Everyone connected to the network will be there." Nora looked down at her father's list, then back at Callum. "Then we stop following the map," she said, "and start using it." Senator Harlan Mercer's fundraiser was held in a hotel ballroom downtown, the kind of room designed to make money feel like virtue. Gold light fell over white tablecloths. Crystal glasses caught the glow from chandeliers. Men in tailored suits spoke softly beside women with perfect hair and careful smiles. Everyone seemed polished. Everyone seemed generous. Everyone seemed clean. Nora Whitaker knew better now. Clean was often a costume. She stood near the entrance in a simple black dress, her injured shoulders stiff beneath the fabric. Her father's evidence hidden in places no one in that room could reach quickly enough. She had not dressed to disappear. Not tonight. For most of her life, people had looked at her body and decided what kind of woman she was before she spoke. Weak, slow, needy, harmless. Tonight, she let them look. Callum stood across the ballroom, close enough to help, far enough not to claim her space. That mattered. He could have walked beside her and made the room part for his name. He could have turned her into someone under his protection. Instead, he watched and waited. For once, the mafia boss understood that the strongest thing he could do was not step in. A silver-haired woman near the donor table looked Nora up and down and smiled with practiced sweetness. "Are you lost, dear?" Nora looked at her calmly. "No," she said. "For the first time, I know exactly where I am." She walked past before the woman could answer. Mercer stood near the stage, surrounded by men who laughed too quickly at everything he said. He looked exactly as he did on television, warm, moral, trustworthy in the way expensive liars often were. When he saw Nora, his eyes moved over her once, dismissing her before he understood she had come for him. "Miss Whitaker," he said quietly, "you are a long way from your basement." Nora smiled. But there was no softness in it. "No, Senator. I brought the basement with me." His smile held, his eyes did not. Nora stepped closer, lowering her voice so only he and the two men beside him could hear. "My father's records are no longer in one place. They are not in one box. Not on OneDrive, not with one witness you can scare. They are archived, copied, sealed, and scheduled for release through people who do not answer to you." Mercer's jaw tightened. "You have no idea what kind of man you are threatening." "I am not threatening you," Nora said. "I am documenting you, for the first time." Senator Mercer looked at her properly, not at her weight, not at her dress, not at the woman he assumed could be ignored, at her. Callum saw the moment from across the room. He saw Mercer understand what he himself had been forced to learn. Nora Whitaker had never been weak. She had simply been misread by fools. Mercer leaned in. "Someone like you thinks she can bring me down." Nora did not blink. "No, someone like me is why you never saw it coming. You only fear people who look powerful. My father taught me to watch the people everyone ignores." By midnight, the first story broke online. By morning, 3 donors had withdrawn from Mercer's campaign. By noon, 2 protected witnesses had contacted attorneys. It would not end in a day. Real corruption never did. But the wall had cracked, and this time, too many people had seen what was behind it. Later, Nora returned to Hargrove. The archive was quiet, the kind of quiet that no longer felt like hiding. Callum arrived with 2 cups of coffee and stopped at the doorway. Is it done? Nora looked at the rows of shelves. No, she said, but it has started. He nodded, accepting the truth without trying to improve it. Nora handed him a small archive box. Inside were Edmund's private journals. On the first page, in her father's careful handwriting, was a single line. Some people are not weak. They are simply carrying more than the rest of us can see. Callum read it, then looked at her. I should have seen sooner, he said. Nora took the page back gently. Yes, she said. You should have. He accepted that. Outside, snow began to fall over Chicago. Nora stood in the archive her father had trusted her to protect. In the body the world had mocked. With the strength they had all mistaken for weakness. And for the first time, in a long time, she did not feel the need to become smaller for anyone. The narrative presented here is fictional and created for artistic expression. Names, characters, and incidents are either invented or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to persons or events is unintended and should not be considered factual or deliberate.
This story is not only about a mafia boss, a hidden map, or a corrupt senator. At its heart, this is a story about human dignity. Nora Whittaker was judged before she was understood. People looked at her weight and decided she was weak. They looked at her quiet nature and thought she had nothing to say. They saw a woman working in a basement archive and assumed she was unimportant. But the truth was different. Nora was not weak. She was carrying more than anyone could see. That is one of the most important lessons in this story. Never confuse appearance with value. Some of the strongest people in life do not look powerful. They do not speak loudly. They do not demand attention. They simply keep standing, keep observing, keep doing what is right, even when the world refuses to respect them. Callum Cain also learns a powerful lesson. He is a man with information, influence, and fear on his side. But through Nora, he discovers that real power is not control. Real power is respect. Protecting someone does not mean deciding for them. Loyalty without honesty becomes manipulation. Love without truth becomes another kind of prison. Edmund Whittaker's map teaches another lesson. Truth must be protected carefully. Evil often survives because good people stay silent, because ordinary records are ignored, because powerful men believe no one will be patient enough to uncover what they buried. Nora proves them wrong. The moral of this story is simple but deep. Do not underestimate people because of their body, their job, their silence, or their place in the room. The person everyone ignores may be the one who sees the truth most clearly. And sometimes, the strength people mock is the very strength that saves lives, exposes lies, and changes everything.